In 1973, Ray Dalio was a 24-year-old employee at a brokerage firm, taking orders from his boss and executing trades someone else designed. 2 years later, he started Bridgewater, but the real transformation wasn't quitting his job. It was a complete rewiring of how he thought about decisions, and I'm going to show you exactly what changed. New York City, 1974. Ray Dalio sits at his desk at Shearson Hayden Stone, one of the big Wall Street brokerage firms. He's 25 years old. He's got an MBA from Harvard Business School. He's smart, capable, working in commodities trading. By all conventional measures, he's doing well. His boss walks over, hands him a file. "I need you to analyze this grain futures position. Client wants a recommendation by end of day." Ray takes the file, opens it, starts running the numbers, does the analysis, writes up his recommendation, submits it to his boss. His boss reviews it, makes some changes, presents it to the client under his own name. The client makes the trade. Ray gets paid his salary. Same amount whether the trade wins or loses. Same amount whether he works 10 hours or 50 hours that week. Same amount regardless of the value he creates. He goes home that night and something bothers him. He can't quite articulate it yet, but there's this nagging feeling. He's smart enough to analyze these markets. He's doing the actual work, but he's not capturing the value. He's trading time for money. His boss is capturing the value. The firm is capturing the value. Ray is just executing tasks. And then it hits him. The fundamental problem isn't the job, it's the mindset. He's thinking like an employee. What does my boss want? What task am I supposed to complete? How do I follow the process that someone else designed? That's employee thinking, reactive, task-oriented, dependent on someone else's system. What he needed was systematic thinking. What principles should guide this decision? What repeatable process would solve this type of problem every time it appears? How do I build a framework that creates value whether I'm personally executing it or not? That shift from employee mindset to systematic mindset, that's what built Bridgewater Associates. Not the capital, not the connections, not even the market knowledge. The mental framework, the way of thinking about problems. And I want to show you exactly how that transformation happened. Because this isn't just Ray Dalio's story. This is the fundamental difference between people who build wealth and people who trade time for money their entire lives. Let me start by being really clear about something. Ray Dalio didn't escape employee mindset by quitting his job and starting a company. Plenty of people quit their jobs and start companies while still thinking like employees. They just become self-employed employees, still trading time for money, still reactive, still dependent on someone else's system. They just happen to be the person executing it now. The real shift was mental, and it happened before he ever started Bridgewater. It happened while he was still working at Shearson Hayden Stone. Let me walk you through it. Ray graduated from Harvard Business School in 1971. He was 22 years old. He got his first real job at Dominick Dominick, a brokerage firm in New York. He worked on the trading floor, commodities, futures. He was good at it. Sharp analytical mind, could see patterns, could run the numbers fast. But here's what I found fascinating when I was reading about this period of his life. He wasn't just executing trades. He was watching how decisions got made, who had authority, who had information, how the hierarchy worked. And more importantly, he was watching what happened to the people around him. There were guys on that trading floor who'd been there 20 years, 30 years. Smart guys, hard workers. They knew the markets inside and out, but they were still employees, still taking orders, still capped at whatever salary the firm decided to pay them. They'd made the firm millions over the years, but they hadn't built wealth for themselves. That observation planted a seed, because Ray looked at them and thought, I don't want to be here in 30 years doing the same thing for the same type of compensation structure. I need a different model. In 1973, he moved to Shearson Hayden Stone. Bigger firm, better position, director of commodities. Sounds impressive, and it was a step up. Better salary, more responsibility, but it was still the same fundamental model. He analyzes markets, makes recommendations, the firm captures the value, he gets a salary. Now here's where the systematic thinking starts to develop. Ray started doing something unusual for a 20-something employee. He started writing things down, not just trade analysis, not just market notes, principles, decision-making frameworks. When he made a decision that worked, he'd write down why it worked. What was the underlying principle? When he made a decision that failed, he'd write down why it failed. What did he miss? What principle would have prevented that mistake? This is completely different from how most employees think. Most employees execute a task, move on to the next task, repeat. There's no reflection, no systematizing, no framework building, just constant reaction to whatever the boss or the client or the market demands next. Ray was building something different. He was creating a documented decision-making system, and this is critical to understand. A system is different from just being good at something. Being good at something means you can execute well. Having a system means anyone following your documented principles can execute well. That's the difference between employee thinking and systematic thinking. Employees develop personal skills. Systematic thinkers develop transferable frameworks. By 1975, Ray had filled notebooks with these principles: observations about how markets work, frameworks for analyzing risk, processes for making decisions under uncertainty. He had essentially built a systematic approach to investing, even though he was still working for someone else. And then something happened that crystallized everything. He got into an argument with his boss. I don't know the exact details, this isn't heavily documented, but from what I've pieced together from interviews and the principles book, it was one of those corporate moments where he disagreed with a decision, expressed his view directly, and got shut down by hierarchy. You know the dynamic. Doesn't matter if you're right, doesn't matter if you have data. If the person above you in the org chart says no, the answer is no. That's how corporate hierarchy works. Authority flows from title, not from truth. And Ray looked at that dynamic and thought, this is fundamentally broken. The best ideas should win. Truth should matter more than title. There should be a meritocracy of ideas, not a hierarchy of positions. That's when he decided to leave. Not because he couldn't handle having a boss, but because the employee model, the hierarchical corporate structure, was incompatible with his systematic approach to truth-seeking. In 1975, at 26 years old, he started Bridgewater Associates out of his two-bedroom apartment in New York. His initial capital was basically nothing, a few $100s, but he had something more valuable than capital. He had a systematic framework. He had those notebooks full of principles. He had a decision-making process that was documented, repeatable, and continuously improving. Now, here's what most people miss about this transition. They think Ray became successful because he started a hedge fund. No, Ray became successful because he thought systematically, and starting a hedge fund was simply the vehicle that allowed systematic thinking to compound. Let me show you the difference with a concrete example. McDonald's wanted to introduce Chicken McNuggets in 1980, but they had a problem. Chicken prices were volatile. If they launched McNuggets and chicken prices spiked, the whole product would become unprofitable. They needed to hedge the chicken price risk. So they called Ray, not because Bridgewater was big, it wasn't, it was tiny, but because Ray had developed a systematic framework for analyzing commodity risk. He documented it, he could explain it, he could show them the principles. Here's how an employee would have approached this. Tell me what you need, I'll run the numbers, I'll give you a recommendation. Task-oriented, reactive, one-time execution. Here's how Ray approached it. He didn't just hedge their chicken risk. He built them a framework. He explained how to think about commodity risk systematically, how to structure hedges based on principles that would work for any commodity, not just chicken. He gave them a decision-making system they could use going forward. That's systematic thinking. You're not just solving the immediate problem, you're building a framework that solves an entire class of problems. And McDonald's paid him well for it. More importantly, they became a long-term client because they didn't just buy a service, they bought access to a systematic approach, and that systematic approach was valuable over and over again. This is how Bridgewater grew in the early years, not by being the biggest, not by having the most capital, by having the most systematic approach to decision-making. Clients could see that Ray wasn't just smart, he had documented, repeatable, principle-based frameworks. But here's where it gets really interesting, because Ray took that same systematic thinking and applied it to building the company itself, not just the investment strategy, the culture, the decision-making processes, the way people interact, everything. This is where the Principles book comes from. It's not a memoir, it's not inspirational stories, it's literally a documented system for making decisions and building an organization. 210 principles, all documented, all battle-tested, all designed to be repeatable. Let me give you some examples of how this systematic thinking manifested in Bridgewater's culture. First, radical truth and radical transparency. In most companies, there's corporate politics. You don't say what you actually think, you say what's politically safe. You manage up, you avoid confrontation. That's employee thinking. Don't make waves, follow the social hierarchy. Ray said no, if you think something is true, say it directly, clearly, no sugarcoating, no politics. That's principle number 1. Truth matters more than feelings. Truth matters more than hierarchy. But he didn't just declare this as a value, he systematized it. All meetings at Bridgewater are recorded. Anyone can access the recordings. You can't say one thing in a meeting and a different thing outside the meeting. The record exists. That's a system enforcing radical truth. Second, idea meritocracy. The best ideas should win regardless of who has them. A junior analyst with a well-reasoned argument should be able to challenge a senior portfolio manager. But how do you actually implement that? How do you prevent it from just being lip service? Ray built a system called believability weighting. Every person at Bridgewater has a track record. If you make predictions, they're recorded. If you make arguments, the outcomes are tracked. Over time, you build a believability score in different domains. And when decisions are being made, people's opinions are weighted by their believability in that specific area. So if a junior analyst has a strong track record in currency markets and a senior person doesn't, the junior analyst's view gets weighted more heavily on currency decisions. That's systematic meritocracy. It's not based on feelings or politics. It's based on documented evidence of who's actually been right about what. Third, the 5-step process. This is Ray's systematic framework for achieving any goal. It goes like this. 1. You set clear goals. 2. You identify the problems preventing you from achieving those goals. 3. You diagnose those problems to get at root causes. 4. You design solutions that address the root causes. 5. You execute those solutions. Sounds simple, but most people don't think this systematically. Most people jump from goal directly to action without diagnosing root causes, or they identify symptoms instead of problems, or they design solutions that don't actually address root causes. Ray documented this process, made it explicit, taught it to everyone at Bridgewater. So now there's a shared framework. When someone's struggling, you don't just tell them to work harder, you walk them through the 5 steps. Where are you stuck? Have you clearly identified the problem? Have you diagnosed root cause? Are your solutions actually addressing that root cause? That's systematic thinking. You create a repeatable framework that anyone can use to solve problems. Now I want to address something important. This approach is controversial. A lot of people hate Bridgewater's culture. They call it cult-like. They say the radical transparency is invasive. The constant recording of meetings feels like surveillance. The believability weighting feels dehumanizing. And honestly, I get it. Bridgewater's culture is intense. It's not for everyone. Ray would be the first to admit that. But here's what I think critics miss. The culture isn't the point. The systematic thinking is the point. You don't have to implement radical transparency to think systematically. You don't have to record all your meetings to document principles. You don't have to create believability scores to build decision-making frameworks. The specific implementations are Bridgewater specific, but the underlying approach, documenting what works, building repeatable frameworks, creating systems that function without you, that's universally applicable. Let me show you how to apply this in your own life, whether you're an employee, an entrepreneur, or somewhere in between. Start with this question: what decisions do you make repeatedly? For most people, this includes things like how to prioritize tasks, how to evaluate opportunities, how to handle conflicts, how to allocate time and money, how to solve recurring problems. Take one of those recurring decision types. Let's say prioritizing tasks. Right now, you probably do it intuitively. You look at your to-do list, you feel which things are urgent, you react to whatever's on fire. That's employee thinking, reactive, intuitive, non-systematic. Here's how to make it systematic. Document your decision-making process. Write down the principles you're actually using, even if you haven't articulated them before. Maybe you realize you prioritize based on deadlines. Okay, write that down. I prioritize tasks by deadline urgency. Now test it. Does that actually produce good outcomes? Or do you end up spending all your time on urgent but unimportant tasks while important but not urgent tasks get neglected? If you notice that pattern, you refine your principle. I categorize tasks by urgency and importance. I do important tasks first, regardless of urgency. I batch urgent but unimportant tasks and delegate where possible. Now you've got a documented principle, a framework. Next time you're prioritizing, you don't have to think it through from scratch. You follow your framework, and over time, you refine it based on what works and what doesn't. That's systematic thinking. You're building a personal operating system. Ray Dalio did this for 40 years. Every time he made a decision, every time he encountered a problem, every time something worked or failed, he documented it, extracted the principle, refined his framework. By the time he published the Principles book in 2017, he had accumulated 210 documented decision-making principles. That's not because he's smarter than everyone else. It's because he systematically documented his thinking for 4 decades, while most people just react to whatever happens next. Here's another practical application. Pain plus reflection equals progress. That's one of Ray's core principles, and it's deeply systematic. Most people experience pain, failure, rejection, loss, mistakes, and they either ignore it, rationalize it, or beat themselves up about it. None of those responses are systematic. Ray's approach is different. When something painful happens, you pause, you reflect, you ask, what went wrong? What was the root cause? What principle would have prevented this? How do I update my framework so this type of failure doesn't happen again? You document that, you add it to your principles. Now the pain has been converted into progress. It's not wasted. It's systematized into improved decision-making. I was reading about Bridgewater's history, and there's this incredible example from the 1980s. Ray hired someone for a senior position. Within a few months, it was clear the person was wrong for the role, terrible fit, creating problems, needed to be let go. Most companies, this just becomes a story. Yeah, we made a bad hire once. Lesson learned, move on. Ray didn't do that. He treated it systematically. He gathered the team. They did a forensic analysis of the hearing process. Where did the decision go wrong? What did they miss in the interview? What questions should they have asked? What principles would have caught this mismatch earlier? They documented everything, created new hearing principles, updated their interview process, built a systematic framework so that type of mistake wouldn't repeat. That's the difference. Employee thinking, we made a mistake, we'll try to do better next time. Systematic thinking, we made a mistake, let's extract the principle, update our framework, and systematize the lesson so it improves our decisions permanently. This is how you escape employee mindset without necessarily quitting your job. You start thinking systematically. You start documenting principles. You start building frameworks. And here's what happens over time. You become more valuable because you're not just executing tasks. You're building transferable systems. You're creating frameworks that others can learn from. You're turning personal knowledge into organizational knowledge. If you do this well as an employee, one of two things happens. Either your company recognizes the value and promotes you into roles where systematic thinking is rewarded, strategy, process design, leadership. Or you accumulate enough documented frameworks that you can take them and build something of your own, like Ray did. But either way, you've shifted from trading time for money to building leveraged systems. And that's the fundamental difference between employee mindset and systematic thinking. Let me give you one more concrete example from my own experience studying this. I used to approach learning reactively. I'd read a book, absorb interesting ideas, move on to the next book. Classic employee thinking. Consume, move on, repeat. Then I started thinking systematically. I created a framework. When I read something valuable, I don't just absorb it. I document it, I write down the core principle, I identify where it applies, I connect it to other principles I've documented, I create a reference system. Now when I encounter a problem, I don't have to remember everything I've ever read. I have a documented knowledge system. I can search my principles, find relevant frameworks, apply them systematically. That shift from reactive learning to systematic knowledge building, that's the same mental shift Ray made when he went from employee to systematic thinker. And the results compound. After 1 year, the difference is small. After 5 years, it's significant. After 10 years, you've built a systematic knowledge base that most people don't have. After 20, 30, 40 years like Ray, you've built frameworks that are genuinely unique and valuable. That's what systematic thinking does. It turns time into compounding knowledge instead of just traded hours. So here's what I want you to take away from this. Ray Dalio didn't build a $150 billion hedge fund by being smarter than everyone else. He built it by thinking more systematically than everyone else, by documenting principles instead of just reacting to events, by building frameworks instead of just executing tasks, by creating systems that compound over decades. You can apply the exact same approach whether you're an employee, an entrepreneur, or anywhere in between. Start documenting your decision-making principles. Build frameworks for recurring decisions. Systematize your learning. Turn pain into progress through reflection. That's how you escape employee mindset, not by quitting your job, by rewiring how you think about problems, decisions, and knowledge. Now I want to hear from you. Are you currently thinking like an employee or thinking systematically? Do you document your principles and build frameworks, or do you react to whatever comes next? What's one decision you make repeatedly that you could systematize? Drop a comment below. If you found this valuable, hit that like button and subscribe. We're releasing new Ray Dalio deep dives regularly, breaking down the systematic approaches that build lasting wealth and sustainable success. You don't want to miss them. I'm your host, this is legendary investor, Ray Dalio, and I'll see you in the next one.